Welcome to Canadian Coffee House Crime. My name is Catherine, and today's case takes us to Buffalo Narrows, Saskatchewan. Buffalo Narrows is 500 kilometers north of Saskatoon in a very remote location that can be accessed to by the bridge or by the ferry. It has a population of around 1,100 people and got its name from the indigenous people who used to hunt buffalo. And the land there narrows and bottlenecks, making the buffalo easier to hunt. In 1790, the first fur trading post for mink developed. Around 1930, a large amount of Europeans settled in the area for fishing. And in 1983, Buffalo Narrows was incorporated as a village. It has a large population of indigenous people called the Métis, which is French for mixed, as the Métis are descendants from a French and indigenous mixed settlement from the 1600s. In 1969, the only white people in the village were teachers, missionaries, and RCMP. On July 30th, 1969, at 3:45 in the morning, RCMP were called to the home of Bernadette and Thomas Pedersen. The phone call had come from a Reverend Andrew Darsh of a Roman Catholic missionary. Corporal Jack Fraser took the Reverend's phone call and was asked to do a welfare check. Him, another police officer, and the Reverend drove out to the home where they discovered a ghastly scene. Frederick Moses McKellen was born in 1949, and on January 30th, 1969, he was 19 years old. He grew up with his mother, who drank all the time and was always on welfare, apparently. He had 3 brothers and 5 sisters, who all have different fathers. He considered living with his mom to be a very unhappy situation. Sometimes he would be sent out into the cold without proper clothing or without enough food. At age 11, he was put into child custody, where he spent a lot of time in foster homes and running away. He felt that the only time he was happy was when he was in Swift Current with some family and with some community that accepted him, but he loved being up north in Buffalo Narrows. He was good at hockey and had been an altar boy. In 1966, he was in jail in Prince Albert for minor offenses, and that is when he started hearing his name being called by people who weren't there. Once he was looking into a mirror and he had seen his face distorted as one eye was bigger than the other. When he heard radio announcers talk about criminals on the radio, he thought it was directed right at him. He started having irrational thoughts that he was a very bad criminal. This is when he started having homicidal fantasies. On January 29th, 1969, 19-year-old Fred, who was 5'5" and 135 pounds at the time, went to a movie. He was staying at his aunt's and cousin's house, and a few houses over, Bernadette and Thomas Pedersen were having a little get-together. At the house were family friends Jean-Baptiste Herman, Paul Marin, and Louis Cotier. Thomas and Bernadette also had 7 children. 5 of them were in the house at the time. The other 2 were at their grandmother's and a friend's house. Fred had gone over to the Pedersens for a beer at around midnight, and he was there for about half an hour. Thomas and Bernadette started play fighting, and they were slapping each other around a little bit, arguing over a bottle of liquor. Fred asked Thomas for a drink, and Thomas had said no, and Thomas asked him to leave. Fred did. This seemed to set Fred off, as he was an undiagnosed schizophrenic, and during a multiple personality blackout, Fred had a breakdown. He found an axe, and at 1 o'clock in the morning, he returned to the 5-room home in minus 40 degrees weather. He punched 2 holes in the front door and unlocked the door on the inside. Paul Marin and Louis Cotier were no longer there, but Jean-Baptiste Herman was sleeping on the couch in the front room when he saw Fred coming in the house with a long-handed fire axe. He jumped off the couch and started for the axe, but Fred struck him in the head once, and Jean-Baptiste stumbled to his knees. Fred proceeded to strike him 2 more times, then Jean-Baptiste fell face up on the floor. Fred then went into the room of Thomas and Bernadette where they were both sleeping. He struck Thomas in the head once, killing him instantly, then struck Bernadette in the head. And then he went to the kids' rooms where he struck each one of the children in their heads using both sides of the axe, killing them instantly. All of them were laying in their beds. Fred then stood the axe on the wall in Thomas's room, and he went to the couch and finished 3 beers. Fred then fled to his aunt's house at around 3 a.m. and burst in the doors covered in blood. His Aunt Mary Garnier and his 15-year-old cousin Cora were asking him what happened. He was just screaming, "I killed somebody," and that he needed the phone. He asked his aunt to call Reverend Andrew Darsh, which she did, and handed him the phone. The Reverend picked up the phone, and Fred tried to talk to him, but Fred sounded out of his mind and drunk, so the Reverend hung up the phone. Fred then proceeded to tell his cousin and his aunt that he killed people, and was saying, "If you don't believe me, look at my arm." It was all blood-stained. Then he was saying, "I could do the same to you." He was telling them that Jean-Baptiste wouldn't die, and he had to chop him up 3 times. But Tommy and the girls died instantly. After he said this, they decided to call the Reverend again 20 minutes later, and Fred was able to say to him, "I've just killed a bunch of people. I've sinned. Come right away." The Reverend went over and talked to Fred. He wanted the Reverend to go over to the house with the holy oil and save the girls and say the last rites as soon as he could get over there. The Reverend decided to call the police and ask them to come over. Corporal Jack Fraser went over to Mary Gardier's house, where he found Fred at the table sipping tea. He talked to the Reverend, and they decided to go to the house for a welfare check, hoping it was just a joke. They brought RCMP Constable Walker Tucker with them. Mary Garnier believed that he had killed somebody, but she had no idea to the extent. The Reverend and the two police officers assessed the situation, and then they called for medical assistance. They had found 2 little dogs, and they had taken them from the scene, and then they went back to Mary's house. 30 minutes after the attack, Fred was put under arrest. At this point, he said, "Sure, I killed them, so what?" Corporal Fraser told them he didn't need to make any statements. Then Fred went on to say, "They're not all dead, 3 are alive." Corporal Fraser led him to the police car, and on the way he said, "I hope they give me the electric chair." Before putting him in the car, he said to Corporal Fraser, "I was going to kill you with an axe tonight, but I'll kill you when I get out." More police officers and an ambulance arrived at the scene at 4:30 a.m. The driver's name was Bruce Clark, and he came with a nurse, Dorothy Dubois. Bruce was reported saying that it was a house of horrors with blood spatter everywhere, even on the ceilings. He said one officer went into shock. At the doorstep, kept going back and forth, getting a glass of water at the sink, and repeating, "It's a bloody massacre," over and over. Nurse Dubois went around the house with a flashlight, where she found Jean-Baptiste Herman, 48 years old, deceased, faced up on the floor in the front room. In one bedroom, she found Thomas Peterson, 32, completely covered and saturated in blood, also deceased. Beside him in bed, Bernadette, who was in the same state. One side of her face was gashed open from her eyeball to the back of her neck. She had a light pulse and was put into the ambulance. The nurse went into the bedroom and found 9-year-old Grace Ann, deceased. Robert Thomas, 6 years old, deceased. Richard Daniel, 5 years old, deceased. And Rhoda Beatrice, 3 years old, also deceased, all with axe wounds to their heads. When shining the flashlight around one of the rooms, 8-year-old Fred Donald bolted up in his bed. Apparently the cushion that he was sleeping on would sink in when he was being hit with the axe in the head, and his wounds were not as severe. Beatrice and Fred were taken by ferry to the St. Joseph's Hospital, as the bridge was snowed over and not accessible at the time. Beatrice died at the St. Joseph Hospital a few hours later. Then Fred Donald was flown to the St. Paul's Hospital in Saskatchewan, where he spent a lot of time recovering from a skull fracture and possible brain damage. Police collected evidence from the scene. They had found the beer bottles with fingerprints on them. The axe they found standing in a corner covered in hair and blood, but no fingerprints. He may have been wearing gloves at the time. They found blood on a butcher knife, a doorknob, and took Fred's bloody clothes to be analyzed in Regina. When arrested, he was asked if he wanted a specific lawyer. He said no. And when asked by Judge Thomas Agnew if he wanted him to find him a lawyer for him, and he had said, if you want to. J.H. Klein Herodens was appointed to Fred, and he decided to plead not guilty by reason of insanity to 7 counts of non-capital murder, and they proceeded with psychiatric assessments. During this time, a funeral for the 7 victims was held at the town hall on February 4th, 1969. 600 people showed. There were 600 people living at the town at the time. The whole town showed up for the funeral. Most of the stores and shops were closed that day. At the same time, Fred's lawyer was complaining to the judge that Fred was suffering because he was in a lightened room 24 hours a day and given no exercise. There was also a dust-up about the jury being only white men, not Métis, like Fred, and he felt he should be tried in front of his peers, which meant a jury in front of his own race. Fred was interviewed by 2 psychiatric doctors, once drugged with truth serum called pentothal, and once undrugged. Dr. Donald Jenkins interviewed him first, undrugged, 15 minutes after he was arrested, and came to the conclusion that he was a psychopath. He said Fred does not appreciate the nature of his acts. He thought he was morally defective. He thought at the time of the killings, Fred was having a schizophrenic episode. He thought his disease might be controllable, but incurable. Dr. Frank Coburn, psychiatrist from Saskatchewan, interviewed Fred while drugged. He stated that he was disgusted at people who killed children, even though he had done that himself. He didn't have much recollection of the murders because he was in a schizophrenic blackout episode. During the interview with the psychiatrist, while drugged, Fred admitted he woke up in the middle of the room. He said it smelled awful, like blood. He said he was in a trance, like he was in a dream. He said he looked in the mirror and saw that it was himself with the axe in his hand, and he said he saw himself bring the axe up and down, and he said he did his damnedest to stop himself, but he couldn't. He said the Pedersons were really good friends. He said that he loved life, and he had fun with life. He loved kids, and that he wasn't crazy. He also said he thought of killing people for a couple of years before the murders and fantasized about killing Mounties, and that he hated them so much he wanted to torture them slowly. The Crown had 14 witnesses and presented 10 exhibits. Dr. Oliver Lane was the last witness to testify for the Crown. He was a pathologist and confirmed the wounds on the heads of the bodies were from a long-handled fire axe. The 8-year-old boy named Fred Donald Patterson was well enough to testify at the trial and made the statement, "I got chopped." After many remands because of psychiatric assessment delays, a trial that lasted a couple weeks found Fred Moses McCullen not guilty on 2 counts of non-capital murder, after juries deliberated for 4.5 hours by reason of insanity. He was ordered to be detained in the Pentagwashni Psychiatric Institute in Ontario for an indefinite period of time. He spent 1 year there and then was transferred to the Saskatchewan Penitentiary in Prince Albert. The psychiatrist had said that he was mentally ill at the time of the murders and the trial, but he no longer was and did not need further treatment. He was transferred to a maximum security penitentiary. Cynthia 10 and Connie 11 Peterson at the time suffer from survivor's remorse, and they've never gotten over the massacre 50 years later and suffer from PTSD. After her parents and her siblings, a total of 6 family members were killed, they stayed with their grandmother. 50 years after the murders, a new gravestone was erected from the funds that were donated. It was reported that Fred was living in Ontario in 2019. Thank you very much for listening here at Canadian Coffeehouse Crime. My name is Catherine, and I look forward to seeing you in the next case.